Hey guys, excited to be here. So this is a joint work with my PhD advisor, whose name is also Itai. What we do in the Gap game is basically analyze cryptocurrency systems. And as you know, these systems usually rely on incentives to ensure their security. And we get actually two disturbing results. And the first being that the participants of the system are actually incentivized to be idle and not participate in the system, which in a sense makes the system less resilient to attacks. And the other result is that these participants are actually incentivized to join forces, which makes the system centralized and then again less resilient to attacks. So I'll start with some background and then we'll get into the details. This is a weird microphone. So in cryptocurrency systems, we have these transactions for users inside the system with their inner currency. And we have other types of users called miners that validate these transactions and group them in blocks. And the blocks are appended to the blockchain, which is in a sense a linked list of all previous blocks and serves as a ledger of all past verified transactions. And to add blocks to the blockchain, we use a proof of work mechanism, which is designed to ensure security. And it requires miners to invest work to create blocks. And more specifically, miners have to combine three factors to create a valid block, which is the header of the previous block, the set of transactions that they wish to include in that specific block, and some in a sense, random value that the finding of it is the actual proof of doing work. The thing about proof of work is that it's a memoryless process. That means that all previous attempts of finding a block do not affect your future success of finding a block. So it doesn't matter if you've been trying to find a block for the last minute or the last hour, your chances are still the same. And well, in Bitcoin, we combine these three and we have to check that the hash of this combination is lower than some value. But you can think of it that there's some protocol-defined condition that you have to satisfy with the value that you search for to create a valid block. So nowadays, proof of work is really, really expensive. Miners actually buy specific hardware to be able to create blocks. And there's also a huge investment on electricity. I heard last week that Bitcoin requires as much power as Denmark, in a sense. So that's pretty expensive. And there's also another thing that in these systems, we want to ensure that blocks are created at a fixed rate, in a sense, or hope to get them in a fixed rate. And we do that by applying a negative feedback mechanism, which is the difficulty parameter, which basically means how difficult it is to create a block. So if we have blocks created too fast, the difficulty becomes more difficult, and then it's harder to create blocks, and vice versa. So the difficulty is affected by the behavior of all miners because they all contribute to the rate of blocks being created. So it's a function of how all the players behave. I'll also mention the longest chain rule, which should be probably called the chain with the most work rule, which states that in case of conflicting chains, miners should choose the chain that has the more work invested in it, and that basically assures that an attacker would have to hold more than 50% of the computational work to be able to take over the system. And as a result of that, we want the chains to have as much work invested in it as possible. So I mentioned that miners have a lot of expenses on hardware and electricity. And what do they get in return for that? So they're incentivized to participate in the system. And that incentive comes in two forms. The first is the minting of new currency. With each new block, some currency is created and allocated to the miner that found that block, that created the block. And they also are awarded with fees from the transactions that they decided to include in their block. There's also this throughput issue that comes in various forms that states that, well, due to the protocol rules, you can't include all the pending transactions in a block. So what miners do is usually they optimize which transactions they want to include in the blocks. And the way to do that, in a sense, is to pick those that offer the highest fees. So in this example, we have 8 transactions and offering different kinds of fees. And let's assume you can only pick 3. So a rational miner would pick the transactions that offer the highest fees, marked in purple in this example. Now, I'll talk about this mining scenario that happens throughout every block in present times. So let's say block 94 was found, and now a miner wants to find the next block. So what happens is a miner considers how much money is about to get and how much money is about to expend on electricity, and has to make a decision. And in this scenario, 5 new coins will be created. Currently, there are no transactions that offer fees, and the expected electricity cost will be 4 coins. So 5 is greater than 4. The miner is about to earn money. So yeah, let's go. Let's start mining. So the miner has been mining for some time, still hasn't found the block. But now some transactions were introduced to the system, and these transactions offer 1 coin as fees. So the miner says, "Oh yeah, I can actually gain more money if I repick the set of transactions that I want to include, right?" And now he's expected to get 2 coins if he finds a block. So he does this recalculation, starts mining again. And I remind you, this is a memoryless process, so it doesn't lose chances by switching the set of transactions. And he starts mining again. And some more time passes, and more transactions are introduced to the system, and he can get 2 coins now. So he does this recalculation and keeps on mining, obviously increasing his expected profit. And after some time passes, he actually finds a block and gets rewarded. So that's what happens nowadays, right? The incentives pretty much say, hey, you should keep mining throughout the entire thing. That's the best strategy. You'll get the most money out of it. But let's talk about what we do today. So we ask ourselves, how much money do you actually get by optimizing the set of transactions that you pick throughout the mining process? So let's say at one point of time, we're expected to get some money. Let's see how does the reward increases over time. So what we did is set up a Bitcoin node and connected it to the network. And every few seconds sampled the available transactions and did a calculation on how much fees we can get. And these are the results. I'll walk you through the graph. So, nice. Yeah, great. So, basically it shows several blocks that I arbitrarily chose. And the y-axis is how much fees you would get from the best 1 megabyte block, which is the size limit in Bitcoin. And you can see that it increases in linear fashion. We actually used the linear regression, and it was a good fit. So fees are becoming more dominant, and that is due to 2 main reasons. The first is that as the popularity of the currency grows, more people want to use transactions. So they actually end up offering more fees to get their transactions included in a block. That's also the explanation on the linear growth of the graph we saw. What basically users do is they sample the available transactions, ask themselves, how much fees would I have to offer to get my transaction included? And by doing so, and then offer, like, outbid that amount by some. And hence, this is why we see the growth in the available fees from the transactions. And another reason for why fees are becoming more dominant is that in some currencies, like Bitcoin, we have a limited supply. That means that with each, that the amount of new coins created with new blocks actually diminishes over time. So eventually, fees will be more dominant even than the block reward. So I'm gonna revisit the mining scenario and hope it's not gonna crash. So in this scenario, as opposed to the previous one, only 1 coin is created, as opposed to the 5 in the previous example. And the costs are still 4 coins. And you can obviously figure out that mining in this scenario is not profitable, because even if you find a block, you're gonna lose money. Let's revisit the scenario. Now only one coin is generated by according to the protocol. And the expected cost is still 4 coins, which means that you're not about to get any money by actually mining. You're about to lose money. So why bother, right? You're in it for the money. You're not going to get anything. So you just stop. You're not going to do anything. And some time passes and transactions are introduced to the system. And now transactions fees are more dominant. So you actually get some more fees by waiting. But still, you're not about to get any money. So why work? Yeah, nobody works for free. So you're still waiting. And some more time passes and more transactions are introduced, offering more fees. And now this is the first time that you're actually about to gain money. So you start mining and eventually find the block. So you see that the incentive are the same, just like divided differently and accumulate over time instead of mostly being there to begin with. And that completely changed the way participants behave in this system. So keep that in mind. And comparing to what we have in present state, this is what we have in what we expect to have when fees become really more dominant. And this was actually introduced in a work by Carlson et al. 2 years ago in CCS. They mainly focused on different things, but they also mentioned this part. Under 2 assumptions. The first is that there's no minting at all, no currency created with new blocks. And that blocks are unbounded, meaning they can include all transactions. And we asked ourselves, well, what happens in the middle and without these assumptions? Because now there's something that works like as we expected. In the future, it's not going to work. Well, works less in a less optimal manner. And what's going to happen in the middle? Where's the point where things flip? So this is what we're doing in this work. And we also analyze the implications of such stops, which are called mining gaps, by the way. So a little spoiler alert, this is a lot closer to us than to them. But yeah, we'll get to that. So what we do in the gap game is basically create a model for cryptocurrency systems that includes the incentives and the expected costs. We define a game played by the miners, which we call the gap game, where the players are the miners. Their strategy is when to start and stop mining. And the utility function is their expected profit. We use mathematical analysis, and we also have a simulator to verify our results. And we also discuss the implications of the results that we get. So I'm gonna walk you through how we get the expected profit of a miner. The full details are in the paper, but yeah, let's try. So all of these are considerations to the expected profit, because obviously the expenses and the incentives, the strategy affects the way the miner is expected to profit, and the behavior of the strategies of other participants affect the difficulty, which affect the chance of you finding a block, which in return translates to affecting the expected profit. So what we start is by finding the block finding time probability distribution function. That part was a bit tricky. It is a combination of exponentially shifted distributions and of course differently shifted and with different rates, just to make it even nicer. But the full details are in the paper. Once we get that, we find the conditional expected profit of a miner, meaning we assume the block was found at some time and then derive the expected profit of a miner. And by combining these two using the law of total expectation, which is sometimes called the smoothing theorem, we get the actual expected profit of the miner. I'll mention that this is an implicit function because, yeah, there's like a lot of sums and integrals in there. So obviously a miner would like to optimize, is rational, he wants to increase his profit. So he will pick the optimal time for him to start mining. And then what we get is the gap game. We have all these miners, all want to optimize their profit, all try to choose the best possible strategy given the other strategies. And we actually optimize, we run this optimization process and find we find that there's an equilibrium point. We actually used a lot of different random seeds starting from different parts, different optimization order, all resulted in the same point. So we're pretty confident this is the only equilibrium point, but we don't really prove that. And now I'll discuss some of the properties of this equilibrium point. But before that, I'll mention that we use this metric that we call EBRR, which is basically the ratio between the expected reward at the start of the mining and the ratio and the expected accumulation of reward throughout the mining. But what you really need to understand is that the lower the EBRR, the more dominant are the fees. So we run these experiments where we pick the number of miners, the expenses, the EBRR, etc., etc. And one of these experiments led us to this point. So in this experiment, the EBRR is 1. There are 8 players, and we see that the gap size is about 0.3, which means that 30% of the time the miner is incentivized to not mine. So think of Bitcoin, that would mean for 3 minutes, once a block is found, the miner would not actually participate. And we repeat this process for a different number of miners and get this curve. And then we change the values of EBRR and get these other curves. And I'd like to remind you that we want the system to be as secure as possible. That means as much work invested in it as possible. So what we want to, where we want to be, it is actually the bottom part of the graph. That's like the most work invested in the system, and the higher we go, that means less work is invested. So you can see that the more dominant the fees, well, the darker the color is. It's actually the darker situation. Yeah, I made a dad joke. Yeah, I know. So yeah, another question that we asked ourselves is actually how much you gain by this optimization process. So we have this graph which is in a similar shape, but what I want to state is that you can look at let's say 8 players for some EBRR, and you see that if these players decide to form 4 groups of 4 pairs in a sense, they would actually gain more by the optimization process, which means they're incentivized to make a coalition. I think this slide proves makes the point more clear. Let's say we have 2 miners and they're expected to get something. If they join forces and become a bigger miner, they're actually going to increase their profit by more than twice. So that means they're incentivized to join forces, and that makes the system centralized, which was we were trying to avoid in the first place by making a cryptocurrency. We also had the Bitcoin test case, meaning we took the Bitcoin parameters as we managed to get and threw them into our model. What we get, and we get that in about 10 years, there will be a 20% gap, assuming everyone will optimize according to our model. Just to conclude, in this work, we have a model and an analysis of rational miners, talking about mining gaps, analyzing how the system becomes less resilient to 51% attacks, and centralization. And please, if you have to take something away from this talk, please consider this when you're designing your system or analyzing current systems. Thank you.
So great presentation.
Thank you.
I was wondering, one of the assumptions in your paper is miners are completely rational. I wonder if this is true in reality. Have you analyzed the blockchain, the Bitcoin miners, if they are really rational in the sense of they don't mine unless they are sure that they will get positive income?
Well, the short answer is no, but a longer detailed answer would be that currently the state of the system incentivizes you to mine throughout the entire thing. So even if we did analyze it, we'll get that people just mine throughout everything. You can actually, if you sample enough blocks, you can find the distribution, but I'm sure you'll find that they're mining throughout everything.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks for the presentation. You mentioned the difficulty parameter is configurable. Did your analysis take into account possible effects of it, and could that be used to solve the gap?
Well, the analysis did consider that, and that's what made the function implicit, because it's actually, if you think of it, the difficulty is you have to get this integral of all the mining times and get it to be a probability distribution function. It's in the paper. I'm sure you didn't understand that, but please read the paper. We didn't consider like attacks on let's stop mining to set the difficulty to make it more feasible to attack in later states. But yeah, this is like a future direction that we considered, and please let's talk about it.
Thanks.
Let's take the speaker again.